Hello, thank you for joining me here for Learning Through Black Literature. This is a more in-depth twist on your traditional book club. Now, for the next few weeks, we will be discussing this book, Black Fortunes. Now, the first millionaire that is discussed in the prologue of the book is William Alexander Leidesdorff. Now, this was a multiracial man who, in 1841, confessed to the love of his life and then fiancée, who is the white daughter of a slave owner, that he wasn't who he said he was, and he revealed that he was Black. Although she loved him dearly, she told him to leave and that she would have to tell her father, which she did, and he had to flee. He witnessed her funeral procession, and then a member of the clergy brought him a keepsake, a piece of jewelry of hers. Although she loved him, her stronghold on tradition and heritage caused her to take her own life, then live miserably without him or happily with him. Now, here we like to go a little bit more in depth in the history that is brought up in the books regarding Black history. So we're going to cover the history behind the prologue in the first chapter and approximately 2/3 of the second chapter. And then we'll continue on next week. We will do this every Monday until we have completed the book. Now, one of the first places brought up in the book is Yerba Buena. Now, Yerba Buena Cove, the name was taken from the Yerba Buena, a native herb of the West Coast, and was abundant in the region surrounding San Francisco Bay. It was a cove on San Francisco Bay where the Mexican pueblo of Yerba Buena was located. It was set back as far as what is now known as Montgomery Street between Clay and Washington Streets. Between the start of the California Gold Rush in 1860, the cove was filled in. Downtown San Francisco was built atop of it. Ship sinkings allowed for owners to claim the land around the sunken ship. So there are some rumors that some people purposefully left sunken ships there or sank ships in order to lay claim to the land. By any means necessary to start building that generational wealth. Some notable sunken ships were the Apollo, the Niantic, the Rome, which was discovered during the construction of the Muni Metro Turnback Tunnel in 1994. Now, from there, we have being discussed the Nantucket Athenaeum. The first Athenaeum came about in the early 1820s. The Nantucket Mechanics Social Library and the Columbian Library Society is what it was called. In 1827, it became the Universal Library Association. In 1834, it was incorporated as the Athenaeum and operated as a private subscription library. Its very first librarian was Maria Mitchell, who went on to become a renowned astronomer. The Athenaeum hosted speakers. It housed abolition conventions, 3 in total. In 1846, a fire destroyed the Athenaeum with over 1,200 titles in all of downtown Nantucket. In 1847, the current building opened. In 1900, it became a free public library. On December 13, 1966, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. On November 13, 1966, it was designated a National Historic Landmark. Now, if we're going to discuss Nantucket, we might as well discuss Nantucket and slavery. Do not be fooled into believing the myth that slavery was just abundant and just a problem in the South. Many of the elite, educated, and wealthy white people advocated for abolition. They lived segregated. Now, while they're advocating, they lived segregated by gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. And keep that in mind, because we're going to circle back to these people a little further down our journey. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, Main Street of Nantucket centered affluent Quakers. And then you had New Guinea, the Five Corners area that housed Black people. And for anyone confused as to why the Nantucket Athenaeum was named the Athenaeum, an Athenaeum is a building or room in which books, periodicals, and newspapers are kept for use. It is also defined as a literary or scientific association. Now, William Lloyd Garrison was mentioned in this book, but here's the thing a lot of people get wrong. They tend to tout him as this uber religious individual because a lot of times to propagandize himself, he gave speeches, which a lot of people denoted as sermons, in churches. He did a lot of pomp and circumstance before the speeches of the likes of Frederick Douglass. But in all actuality, he was not a churchgoer and really didn't believe in the church. He was deistic. He was connected with the belief in a God, especially a God that created the universe, but that God doesn't take part in it. Now, another notable landmark that was quite significant during the time and in this book was the African Meeting House. It was a one-room building at the corner of York and Pleasant Street, 29th York Street. In 1827, it was constructed under the African Baptist Society. It was the last remaining public structure central to the African American community of the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1933, the property was purchased by Florence Higginbotham, who owned the property next door and understood the importance of the property. According to her biography, did she truly understand the importance of it, or was it just another means of income? In the 1960s and 1970s, the Nantucket Restoration Revival bypassed the property completely. In 1989, the Higginbotham family sold the property to the Museum of African American History in Boston. In 1999, it reopened to the public post-restoration. Now let's discuss a little bit about the woman who purchased it. Florence Elizabeth Clay Higginbotham, 1893 to 1972. She was formally trained at the Boston Cooking School. In 1911, arrived in Nantucket to work for the summer in the Sconset. In 1920, she was hired to manage the Underhill Cottages and lived with Evelyn Underhill, the owner of the Underhill Cottages. She purchased a home in the New Guinea neighborhood and used it for rental income. The historic Seneca Boston home is the home that she purchased in New Guinea. In 1929, the market crashed and caused her to move with Underhill, her boss, well, former boss at this point, into her Seneca Boston home. In 1933, she purchased the African Meeting House and rented it out for storage and once as a studio. That's why I said, did she really understand the importance of it, or was it just additional income to her? In 1989, her son Wilhelm sold the property, and that's when it became the Museum of African American History in Boston. And I'd like to point out, recall that she lived from 1893 to 1972, and in 1989, her son sold the property. See, we see a lot of pictures like this and make the assumption and are constantly told things are so long ago. There was no one alive in our lifetime. There was no one alive in our parents' or grandparents' lifetime that endured certain things. Are you sure about that? Are you sure about that? And another reason I brought up, did she really understand the importance of it? Because by the time restoration efforts were taking place, there was a lot of leaking. There were a lot of spills there. It was more about additional income. But I will say she is one of the stories where the tide did turn. She started off working for a white person, and then that white person ended up dependent upon her. And she is one of thousands of stories that when Black people say that if we wanted revenge, it could have happened generations ago. Because so many times were white people placed into the dependency of us. But let's now discuss Absalom Boston, 1785 to 1855. A United States mariner, the first Black captain to sail a whale ship with an all-Black crew in 1822. Born in Nantucket, Seneca Boston was his father and a former slave. Thankful Micah was his mother, and she was also Wampanoag. In 1770, his uncle, Prince Boston, a slave at the time, was part of a whaling voyage, and he refused to give his earnings to his master. He went to court and won his freedom and his earnings. He was the first Black slave to win freedom via a United States jury trial. And he is one of many that when certain historians say, oh, well, slavery wasn't so bad, they had the ability to opt out of slavery through becoming Christians or suing their way out. But these are people who were not earnestly taught how to read and write, but learned the languages because it was the Black people who were kidnapped and enslaved that were forced to be the translators because their owners could not learn the varied languages of the people they had stolen. And even without the capacity to fully read or write the legislation and no formal education, let alone legal education, enslaved Black people did take to becoming baptized so that their children could be free and did utilize the court systems in many ways. Hence, a lot of legislation began to change and shift in different portions of the colonies throughout the entirety of chattel slavery within the United States. In Absalom's early years, he worked in the whaling industry. In 1805, he acquired enough money to purchase property in Nantucket. In 1822, he became the captain of the industry, an all-black manned whale ship. They took a 6-month journey, which garnered 70 barrels of whale oil, and none of his men were lost, which was a huge feat now and is still a huge feat today. And it was after this 6-month voyage that Absalom officially retired from whaling. In 1815, he obtained a license to open and operate a public inn. After retiring from sea, he ran for office and concentrated on being a community and business leader. He led the Nantucket abolitionist movement with Edward Pompey. He was a founding trustee of Nantucket's African Baptist Society and the African Meeting House. In 1845, Phoebe Ann Boston, his daughter, was barred from attending school. He successfully sued the Nantucket municipal government to integrate the public education system. It's amazing how when you really start to uncover and learn unrevisioned history, that whole racial trope, that myth that Black people do not care about education and never have cared about education and were okay with being uneducated while enslaved, and let Ron DeSantis tell it, discovering and learning skills is nothing more than a myth, a falsehood. Because you had Black people suing to get into schools. Suing to get into schools. Because you hear the year 1845. 1845. When did the parameters of slavery change? You may know that as, when was slavery abolished? No. When were the parameters of slavery changed? It wasn't 1845. It was not. Now, the next millionaire that is brought up in the book is this lovely woman, Mary Ellen Pleasant, August 19, 1814 to January 11, 1904. She was a 19th century entrepreneur, financier, real estate magnate, and abolitionist. Basically, she was what Donald Trump failingly pretends to be. Arguably, she is the first self-made Black woman millionaire. Arguably. She did accrue her millions decades before Madam C.J. Walker. Per the 1890 United States Census, she classified herself as being a capitalist by profession. Her goal was to earn as much as possible to help as many people as possible. So although she proudly carried the moniker of capitalist, she did not look at capitalism the same as people look at capitalism with their millions in 2023. She was a friend and financial supporter of John Brown. Look at there. Who was sponsoring whom? Who has been paying for whose work through the years? And most likely, she was the financier of the raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia in 1859. During the gold rush, she helped women in California regarding staying safe and becoming self-sufficient. Post-Civil War, she won multiple civil rights victories. And that is how she became known as the mother of human rights in California. Now, some of her legal battles did have mixed results. Now, in the 1820s, she was in Nantucket, and it is believed that she heavily assisted with the Underground Railroad. She also met her first husband while in Nantucket. His name was James Smith. He was a carpenter and contractor in New Orleans. And this was also a man who would go to the slave markets to purchase people out into their freedom. But he would hobnob and cackle it up with the masters and the slave owners as if he was one of them, and he identified himself as Cuban. More than likely, he was biracial, but it was more accepting of him to say that he was Cuban than just flat out black. When he died, she received a quite substantial inheritance. In 1848, she remarried John James Pleasant, who formerly worked for her first husband. In 1852, she moved to San Francisco after her second husband had been out there for quite a while. Her businesses in San Francisco included her investing wisely during the gold rush, and part of her investments were into silver, because a lot of people don't realize that somewhat simultaneous to the gold rush, there was also a silver rush. She opened boarding houses and laundries, and she employed mostly Black people to do that. She had properties in San Francisco, Oakland, and Canada. She concealed her exact wealth from those around her. She didn't want anybody to know just how wealthy she was. This woman could walk around with thousands of dollars on her person. No one was the wiser. When she loaned money, she loaned it out face to face. She collected her interest and her repayment face to face. She also continued to work as a housekeeper for prominent merchants. This allowed her access to private conversations and investment information. She made financial contributions to the Athenaeum Building of San Francisco, the Black Press, the American Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. In 1866, a streetcar driver refused to stop for her. She had purchased her tickets in advance. She sued the North Beach and Mission Railroad Company. The company did not accept Black people on their streetcars. And at the time, San Francisco didn't have explicit segregation laws, therefore the streetcar transportation system. Also during this time, there was a ban on Black testimony against white people, and that prevented her from testifying in open court. White witnesses did speak up on her behalf, allowing the case to move forward. Pleasant was then awarded damages totaling $500. The case was appealed to the California Supreme Court. The lower court was overturned because it wasn't proven that the company had a policy excluding Black people or that the conductor's actions had been racially motivated. Now, the courts were forced to reinstate that California had no laws that allowed public carriers, which included streetcars, to exclude anyone based on their race. An additional nugget. See, Mary Pleasant was the daughter of a traveling salesman who was a Black man. And there were certain things called freedom schools that were all over the country. There were few at the time throughout the colonies. And she was sent to Nantucket to go to one of those. And although her father called the family friends, they were not. They were just somebody on his route that said that they would sponsor her, that they would give her a place to live while she went to school. They did not. They put her to work in their store as free labor while collecting money for room, board, and tuition from her father. And it was there that Mary Pleasant decided to start observing people and their mannerisms and how they were, and getting very close to white people and presenting herself as an acceptable Negro that was no more than subservient. Hence the fact that she continued to work in a domestic position, even though oftentimes her net worth was far greater than the people that she worked for. Now, later in life, while working for a gentleman called Thomas Bell, a wealthy man involved with banking and real estate, she was accused of pushing him downstairs to his death. The coroner determined his death was accidental, but that didn't stop rumors that began claiming she practiced voodoo. She continued to work for the family until there was a disagreement with Teresa Bell. Now, Sarah Althea Hill versus William Sharon, and William Sharon was a former senator. Pleasant supported Hill in her claim that she was Sharon's wife and that she wanted a divorce. Hill was then sent to an asylum. The press coverage portrayed Pleasant as a mammy. She was running into all sorts of bad press towards the end of her life. But isn't that how it always is, especially when a Black woman accrues wealth? They want to associate you with something that societally they view at the time as demonic. Like when you have a Black person now, especially a Black woman, who achieves something great, then all of a sudden you're a part of the Illuminati. If this is such a secret society, why does everybody know everything about it? But if any other race of woman or any other race of person goes to sleep mediocre and broke on Monday, but wakes up extraordinary and wealthy on Tuesday, no one bats an eye, no one questions it. In 1904, she died, apparently penniless, after years of rumors and speculation. Because why let a Black woman be great? Absolutely why. Now let's take some time to discuss for a little bit her friend, John Brown, May 9th, 1800 to December 2nd, 1859. He had beliefs rooted in strict Calvinism, meaning he believed slavery was a sin against God. As a youth, he served as a conductor with his father, Owen Brown, for the Underground Railroad. In 1835, he bought land in Northeast Ohio. In 1837, in part due to the financial panic, he couldn't satisfy his debts. In 1842, he declared bankruptcy and later tried to peddle American wool in Europe and was forced to sell at highly reduced prices. This led to multiple lawsuits upon his return to the United States. In 1825, he moved his family to Guy Mills, Pennsylvania, where he set up a tannery and built a house and a barn. And the barn had a hidden room for runaway slaves. Reportedly, he helped 2,500 slaves. In 1907, the barn, was destroyed. In 1836, he moved his family back to Ohio. In 1837, Elijah Lovejoy, a journalist and editor of the anti-slavery St. Louis Alton Observer, was attacked and killed at the headquarters of said publication by a white mob. And who stuck their nose in it and went to help? None other than yours truly, with a multitude of other people as well. But I'm sure no one ever stopped to tell you just how broke John Brown was. And I can definitively tell you, no one has ever discussed with you how he was getting the funds to travel and partake in all of these raids and help all of these fugitive slaves. Now let's move on to Wendell Phillips, November 29th, 1811 to February 2nd, 1884. He was a United States abolitionist, Native American advocate, attorney, and orator. From 1850 to 1865, he was a preeminent figure in American abolitionism. He served on the Boston Vigilance Committee as a part of the Executive Committee. In 1854, he was indicted in his role in the attempted freedom aid to Anthony Burns. He was a Garrisonian abolitionist, which means he believed that the Union needed to be dissolved to achieve abolitionist goals. He denounced the Constitution due to its upholding of slavery. Let me repeat that back to you. He denounced the Constitution due to its upholding of slavery. He was heavily influenced by his wife, Anne Terry Green, who he married October 1837. And before people speak on it, yes, there was a time where the Native Americans were enslaved. In the 18th century, it was prohibited, and proving direct maternal ancestry would be grounds for freedom. So, if one could prove that there was Native ancestry on the mother side, they had to be legally let go from slavery. Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot of Black people say, oh, yeah, I have this in my family. That's why my hair looks this way. A lot of people, just like with the, excuse the terminology, but that's what it's called, the $5 Indian rule. With a $5 Indian roll, there were white people that were paying to put their name on the roll for financial gain. But there were Black people that were trying earnestly to prove that they were Afro-Indigenous to get out of slavery. Now, there are a wealth of Afro-Indigenous people who truly did have that lineage. Now, for a brief moment, let's discuss Lewis Hayden. December 2nd, 1811 to April 7th, 1889, born into slavery in Lexington, Kentucky. His mother was of African, European, and Native American descent, and his father was a slave that was sold off early. His first owner was Reverend Adam Rankin, a Presbyterian minister, and he sold Hayden's siblings in preparation for moving to Pennsylvania. He then traded a 10-year-old Hayden for 2 carriage horses to a traveling coach salesman. And then his second owner permitted Hayden to learn about varied views on slavery. At 14, he received a tip hat from Revolutionary War soldier Lafayette, which inspired him to hate slavery and desire respect. This is why I say you never know who could be inspired by you and what gesture that may be so innocuous to you, so small to you, but the greatest thing ever and the most influential thing ever. Because as my daddy says, we don't live to ourselves and we don't die to ourselves. So be mindful what you put out there. In the mid-1830s, he married Esther Harvey, a slave. Her and their son were sold to Henry Clay, a U.S. senator. They were sold into the Deep South, and they were not seen again by Hayden. In the 1840s, he taught himself to read. Even though he was now in the possession of an owner that whipped him mercilessly. Now, he did convince Louis Baxter, an insurance office clerk, and Thomas Grant, an oil manufacturer and tallow chandler, to purchase him after he approached them proposing that he could be hired out and they could keep a portion of his earnings. Yes, he negotiated his own contract for work. He was then hired out to the Phoenix Hotel in Lexington, Kentucky. In 1842, he married Harriet Bell, also a slave, and he unofficially adopted her son Joseph. At the time, his wife and stepson were owned by Patterson Bain, and it's at this time that he started planning to escape out of fear of being separated from yet another family, another wife, and another son. In 1844, they successfully escaped to Boston. In 1845, they moved to Detroit from Canada and founded a school for Black children and the Colored Methodist Society, which is now Bethel Church. In January 1846, moved to Boston and owned and operated a clothing store on Cambridge Street. Now, that brings us to Mr. Anthony Burns, May 31st, 1834 to July 17th, 1862. In 1854, he escaped slavery in Virginia. On May 24th, 1854, a warrant via the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was issued and arrest was made via Deputy Marshal Asa O. Buttman. His owner, Suttle, hired out slaves and petitioned the court for action. The court denied in favor of Suttle. The court decided in favor of Suttle. Burns spent 4 months in jail, causing him permanent disability and poor health. The capture and trial cost between $40,000 and $50,000 just to prove that the act would and could be enforced. In 1855, for $1,300, via a Black minister, Leonard Grimes of the Baptist Black Bostonians bought his freedom. And keep in mind, this minister did not just come out of pocket with this money. The community came together, rallied together, and crowdsourced the money to ensure that he could be set free. Now, mind you, they set his price for freedom at $1,300, but the cost of seeking him out, capturing him, holding him in prison, holding the trial was between $40,000 and $50,000. If nothing else, racists are not good financially. He then studied theology at Oberlin College and possibly Fairmont Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio. In August of 1858, in Maine, he prepared to present a panorama, grand moving mirror exhibiting the degradation and horror of American slavery. In 1860, he took a position at a Baptist church in Indianapolis. He shortly moved to the Zion Baptist Church in St. Catharines, Canada West, which is now Ontario. In 1862, he died of consumption. Now, consumption during that time was defined as dying of consumption was slow and excruciating due to a destructive bacteria that reduces lung function and capacity. The chest fills with blood as lung tissue is destroyed and turns to liquid. The person eventually drowns. Okay, sorry about that. We got one page of notes out of order. My apologies. My apologies. I am nothing if I am not human. Let's make sure I've covered everything on Mr. Bell. Yes. Now, so my apologies. Looks like I missed some information regarding Mr. Brown, so we are going to double back to Mr. Brown for just a moment. Like I said, my apologies. So John Brown, okay, by the end of 1855, Brown located to Kansas with 6 of his sons and his son-in-law. On May 24th, 1865, he led a group of abolitionists into a pro-slavery settlement near Potawatomi Creek. Per his orders, 5 slavery sympathizers were taken from their homes and killed with broadswords. Newspapers denounced him and the attack. This didn't dissuade him from participating in battles. By 1859, he lost Frederick Brown, his son, during the fighting. In December of 1858, he and his allies freed 11 slaves in Missouri and led them to Detroit, which was 1,000+ miles. One woman gave birth along the way, and during the raid, a slave master was killed. President James Buchanan placed a $250 bounty on the head of Brown. October 16th, 1859, with 18 men, 5 of them were black, they seized the Harper's Ferry Armory in hopes of large rebellions would follow. And also, one side note regarding the San Francisco Athenaeum and Literary Association, it was the first black circulating library in the West. In 1853, it was organized by William H. Newberry, a photographer and journalist, due to the growing black population in San Francisco. William H. Newby. Newby and Mifflin Wister Gibbs were the founders. It became the nation's first black jurist. Mifflin Wister Gibbs became the nation's first black jurist and the U.S. consul to Madagascar. So once again, my apologies on missing that one. Hayden, Anthony Burns. Alrighty. And since I did miss this while I was discussing him, this is Mr. Lewis Hayden. And for today, we are going to close out by discussing the Boston Vigilance Committee, 1841 to 1861. It was an abolitionist organization created to protect escaped slaves from being kidnapped and returned to slavery. Notably helped George Latimer, Ellen and William Craft, Shadrach Minkins, Thomas Sims, and Anthony Burns. The members coordinated with the Underground Railroad conductors to provide funds, shelter, medical attention, legal counsel and aid, transportation, and sometimes weapons. They kept an eye out and alerted regarding slave catchers. Some even took part in violent rescue efforts. But I also need you to realize that a lot of the people, especially in and around Nantucket and in the northern colonies, that sat on abolitionist committees or denoted themselves as abolitionists still held slaves and refused to let their slaves go. And a lot of them were firm, unwavering proponents of gradual abolition, which did little to nothing to truly guarantee anyone's freedom. So, I hope you learned a little bit more about Black history. And if you have not gotten the book as of yet, there is still time. Like I said, just through the first chapter and about 1/3 of the second chapter thus far. So there's still time for you to catch up. And I hope this additional information in history helps you further understand everything going on. Should you have any questions or you want anything specifically discussed as you read through here, please email me at asktaz77@gmail.com. There will be every Tuesday excerpts read from the book. So on Monday, we'll do the full breakdown, and Tuesday, we'll go over excerpts and give breakdowns of those excerpts. So as always, each one teach one, each one reach one, and I will see you all next time.